At WFM Labs, our organization recognizes the importance of gaining market insights to compete effectively and provide better goods and services to our customers. However, exchanging price or commercially sensitive information with competitors can violate antitrust laws and harm competition. To avoid antitrust risk, it is essential to ensure that information exchanges in the WFM Labs community are reasonable and promote competition. This includes avoiding discussions or coordination of sensitive topics such as customer prices, pricing paid to vendors, compensation paid to employees, or proprietary information. If you would like more information, please refer to the guidelines outlined by the FTC and DOJ, Antitrust Guidelines for Collaborations Among Competitors. In addition, WFM Labs meetings are being recorded. By continuing to be in the meeting, you are consenting to be recorded. And finally, we ask that all participants review and comply with our code of conduct. Thank you.
Good evening. Tonight, we're going to go through this cost of attrition calculator, the components of attrition costs, the dynamic calculator we published. I want to take a few moments and expose the math behind this for everyone. And after I'll post this Excel file, really the math behind that I'll share with everybody tonight is what drives that dynamic attrition calculator. And really the big question here is, have we captured everything? Is this useful? Do we want any enhancements to it before we move on to some of the other topics, especially over the next month around Monte Carlo simulation? So thanks for joining. I'll kind of jump right into it. We're basically WFM Labs. We're reinventing things. Not going to spend a lot of time here. I'm a little bit of a broken record, but we think there's new ways to look at workforce management practices, and that's what WFM Labs is all about. We're sitting here sharing practices, challenging old ways that we've done things, and looking for a new framework where employees are prioritized first. We leverage automation and simulation, and really attrition is one of the big things that we're looking to solve here out of this. Which is why we presented the attrition calculator. Last month, we had a discussion on the maturity model. We will, over time, periodically review this, come back to it to understand, hey, is this right? We've got it out there now. Continue to get some feedback on that. Tonight's session is really about this high cost of attrition. I believe this calculator itself can be leveraged by people to really express, why this is so important. A lot of people underestimate the true costs of attrition. A few weeks ago, I did a session where we recorded and just kind of spoke to the problem statement. A lot of reps or not a lot of reps, a lot of executives look at the cost of attrition. They sort of figure, hey, somebody's going to take 4 weeks in training. That's a month of salary. If I've got 40% annual attrition, 500 employees, my attrition's costing me roughly 800 grand. I can live with that, even though that's still a lot of money. But a lot of times we aren't thinking about recruiting costs. A lot of organizations have, costs to go out and leverage firms, onboarding costs. I know that in my past, we had soft dollars. We had to pay IT, HR, and there's hard dollars as well for equipment and everything. At the end of the day, it's not just the training, but there's training attrition. So we typically, if we need to hire, if we need to get 20 people out onto the floor to take calls, we probably have to hire 25, maybe more, based on people who drop out of classes. So that additional attrition is a function. And then a big thing that is often underestimated is really the inefficiencies with new hires. So the cost of nesting and the speed to proficiency. And that's what we've done with this calculator is we've kind of mapped this out so that anyone can pick this calculator up, run their own numbers through it, and uncover how much higher attrition costs really are than what people perceive. I'll pause there and see if anybody's got any other inputs before I begin to pivot to the calculator itself. Are there other things that we see out there that should be thought about? I'll just open it up and see if anybody has any comments.
I have an opinion, but I'll wait unless I'm the only one. It was yeah, nobody else talking. Cool. Okay. I was sort of thinking about this more, Ted, and you're right that like most often operations finance will understate the impact of attrition and the cost of it. But I was also thinking about if you sort of take these calculators and you take this methodology and you translate it to sort of your real world call center or your business, and everybody has a little bit of a different setup, and maybe you're mostly outsourced, but that still matters because when you have outsourced partners and maybe you're paying for FTE, or maybe you're paying billable hours, or maybe you're paying by call, or whatever it might be. So there's varying degrees of impact from attrition to your bottom line in your business, but there's still something there. I think I was trying to think about the different types of attrition. There are types of attrition, frankly, that are good. You could have people, for example, maybe they're running 10% higher handle time. Handle time's one dimensional, it's one metric, right? You could be running a really good handle time, but have a horrible transfer rate or a repeat call rate. And so you have to kind of take the whole piece. But I started thinking about it more in terms of that. So that might be going a bit farther than where you intended to go with this, Ted, but it was starting to think, how do you use these things?
And no, really, I don't think it does. One of the other areas that I've got a separate model built out is in certain organizations, there's also a top line impact, and I haven't built that into this calculator. So, and I'll just use an example from, my cable days was when we lost an employee, the potential for a new hire to retain a customer who might want to flip to another provider was lower than a tenured employee. So there is, and I haven't gotten any feedback from anyone yet on that, but I do have a separate component. If you're able to actually price turnover to top line revenue, we could be expressing that as well. So Dave, no, I don't think you're going, beyond it. It just becomes a question of, is this, are some of these other factors things that are useful to build into the model? So think about that. And I guess we're recording these so that other people who can't join us can also provide feedback. Again, the model itself is out there, and I'm going to expose that. But just as Dave gave a few examples, there may be other components that we want to build into the model. And at the end of the day, we can do so. I mean, I've got this built already into a web-based application, which I'll pivot to for a moment here. The web-based application that I think I've published the link enough times out there in our forums allows you to put in your own data to dynamically estimate based on the workload, and we really start with workload as a spot and use a fairly simple calculation, which I'll expose in a moment, where we can just take annual calls, work hours, the handle time, shrinkage, and occupancy to ultimately calculate a base required head count. And we do so just so that we have something to bounce our turnover rate up against. So while this is an actual workload calculator, you say, well, why am I worried about workload and volume and handle time? It still allows you then to buy specific call groups instead of just saying, 600 head count. I can actually go and do the math and really just figure out, what is the head count associated on those numbers. On the second tab is where all the inputs are in the model itself. You put in, obviously, your annual attrition. Are you running 30%, 40%, 50%? What's the training length itself? That's the traditional component that, I said earlier, I think most executives I've worked with, they'll do back of the napkin math and they'll say, hey, it's 8 weeks training. I know I'm going to lose a person for 2 months. If I'm paying, $48,000, all right, that's X. and they sort of leave it at that. But we know as well that training has attrition itself, and that has a cost factor to it. And really the piece that I exposed on a video a couple of weeks ago is this model that we use to really factor in the speed to proficiency. And that's the one I've seen time over time where it ultimately is where a lot of hidden dollars are. We use a simple model. We could get fancier with this as well, but I don't know if there's a great return on it. And I honestly don't know many people who look at speed to proficiency as being something different than a linear model. What the AHT on day one is simply saying, hey, if it's 500 seconds handle time, then somebody who's starting on day one is 1,000 seconds as opposed to 500 seconds. And our speed to proficiency simply says, how quickly do they get to being as proficient as everyone else? And then we have two inputs to financially model it, the actual base salary. And then I just bucketed onboarding costs, along with anything else that people may want to incorporate into, hey, well, it costs my recruiter, it costs IT. A number of people I've spoke to have a rough idea. It's never an exact science. And I hear a wide range. Hey, it's $1,000 an agent, it's $5,000 an agent. But we give you that flexibility to put in a number relative to what it costs to onboard people aside from the lost time. And then the final piece is the output. We, in the calculator itself, attempt to separate your base required headcount along with the total headcount that's required based on turnover. And we've taken and we've priced out what a base budget looks like and then what your total budget looks like with attrition so that we can understand the cost to the business of attrition. And then we further break that out into a training cost and onboarding costs. And we segment out the speed to proficiency because again, that's a hidden area that I believe a lot of people, underestimate or just don't even have solid ways to, produce that number. We all build it into our capacity plans, but difficult to just kind of produce it on a sheet. And so again, wfmlabs.org/calculators is where this is published right now. You're welcome to pull it up, play with it. If you haven't played with it before, I'm not going to demo it here. I think I've demoed it on enough calls and shared it enough. But let me just pause there and see if I've got any other comments from everybody who's joined. And then I'm going to expose the mathematical model that's behind this.
No questions. Again, I think you've covered a lot. You've made it very user friendly, and so I think it's great to be able to jump in and within a few keystrokes and a couple triggers, you've got some really solid information.
Yeah, that's what and people love levers and dials. It's one of the things I built these calculators using a tool called Excelsius years ago. And I've had trouble finding something to really replace it because I didn't go in and code all this stuff. This is actually a spreadsheet behind it, but it does a beautiful job of putting it into an HTML enabled file where people can go and sit and play with the levers, and people love to do that. So
yeah, that's great.
The math behind it is what I'll pull up on the spreadsheet. Now I'll share this after the call and post it once I post the video so that anyone watching the recording can grab the spreadsheet and say, hey, your math is wrong, or hey, what if we wanted to add this, or hey, I'd love to go and code this into my own application instead of just doing your application. So I'm going to actually pull that up right now and just walk you guys through the math behind it and see if you guys have any thoughts, comments, questions around it. If it works and it's useful, fantastic. Take the spreadsheet, run. I'd love to have people kick the tires on it as well and just say, hey, well, I'm thinking maybe you're missing something here. But essentially, I'm not going to show you the coding that translates the spreadsheet into that HTML file. But this is basically the math that drives that website that I mentioned. And you can grab the spreadsheet and then really do the same thing in the spreadsheet and expose what I'm going to show you, just showing somebody an Excel file. But like I said, a lot of people like the little dials, and they can, I think, more logically follow you know, what the HTML file does as opposed to what's in the spreadsheet. So essentially the workload piece is a calculation we've used as just kind of a top-down calculation we've used for years. I have a lot of colleagues who use it. I don't know, maybe there's some other math out there, but if somebody ever comes to me and says, hey, Ted, we need to take 10 million calls, they're 443 seconds long, and I go and model whatever our occupancy level is going to be based on the service level and pump in a shrink number, the FTE required is simply a, you know, basic calculation, your workload, you know, call volume times handle time. We turn it into seconds, we divide by the number of hours, and then we inflate the head count, you know, by occupancy, and then 1 minus shrink. This top section is just simply so that we can get a base head count to work with. You could just shortcut this as well if you wanted, say, well, let's forget about this and just say, I want to put in a model that says I'm using 1,000 head count or 500 or 10,000 head count. Second piece is pretty straightforward as well, is, well, how many head FTE do we need to replace? If my attrition is 40%, I got 1,000 people, well, I'm going to turn over, you know, 400 people over the year. But at the end, we know that's what falls short in terms of, well, I can't just plan for 400 people in terms of replacing those. I've got to consider these other things over here. This is the math that I did a video on, I think 2 weeks ago, which is this speed to proficiency hack. Give credit to a gentleman by the name of James McMahon, who came up with this idea a number of years ago. We wanted to do kind of a back of the napkin calculation that captured speed to proficiency in a simple way without sitting there and trying to map it out every single week that somebody comes on and looks at it. So we basically have two inputs. How many months does it take someone to become proficient, and where do they start out on day one? And I won't go into tremendous detail because there's a whole video on it, but this is the hack that James came up with. You know, we said, well, let's figure out a proficiency factor up here, which is simply over here, if it takes them 6 months to become proficient and they're 50% proficient on day one, that means effectively they're going to improve their proficiency by 8% each month. And then we built out this little table that simply says, okay, here's our learning curve, 12 months. Here's our tenured handle time, which is just coming from this value over here. And based on this number right here, we can say simply, okay, that's 1 minus or 1 divided by, you know, two times, or they take 888 seconds on month one. And then by using this proficiency factor here, we essentially are saying, well, they're 50% proficient, and then they're going to go up by 8 points every single month until they become as proficient as everyone else. So I won't drill on this too long. I will pause and see if anybody has any comments on it, but we did a whole video that sort of explained this logic behind just using speed to proficiency. How fast are they on day one? And creating this table that shows effectively their learning curve and how fast they go from being inefficient to as efficient as everyone else. Is that logical, or any comments, questions on that piece before I move on?
It's logical but linear, and so that I mean what you've just said, and that could be one of the constraints of this. But again, the question is, how complex do you want to make this versus the value of it? And so,
yep.
I just thinking about users, like, they just need to understand this is a linear speed to proficiency, but the reality is maybe something different in your contact center. And okay, maybe they can come in and change something back here, but ultimately, I feel like I've been the same for years and years, Ted. I've always used the linear one. We usually start with, well, we're about here, and then we 10% better or whatever.
Yep.
The other thing I was thinking about on this, just to be a pain, so I keep saying this to my team all the time, like we think quite one-dimensional or one metric. So if you're a new hire, that you're not just potentially driving impacts from handle time, but maybe you're driving repeat calls, maybe you're driving some other things, other inefficiencies that will take you time to get up to proficiency. So yeah, not saying, well, let's go ahead and build all those extra things in, but maybe. And so
Yeah.
kind of a question to the group: does it feel like that's a big enough impact? Some areas might be impacted more than others when we think about the different call types in the call centers that might use this, but there are other things that drive essentially your call load, right? Your workload. It's not just the handle time. So again, I'm not wanting to overcomplicate this thing, because I think it's great. It's great for kind of taking that. It's a more sophisticated measure of cost of attrition versus the back of the napkin that most people will do. But then how much more sophisticated do we want to make it, or is the return on that worth it or not? So I don't know. It's just kind of throwing that out there, right? That we all know there are other things, and so it's just, but maybe they're not that big a deal.
Well, Dave, to that point, I mean, we, net to Dave's point is, it's really the output that we go for. Again, I think, historically, we use a proficiency curve for handle time as well. And to Dave's point, again, I don't know that you want to get too complex, but what we find is they actually have a point where they hit proficiency, and then the new hires go lower. Then they learn all the tricks from tenured agents and they come back up. So technically, ultimately they kind of end up where the tenured agents are. But I'm wondering if maybe a simplified way to do it, an either or, if you want to account for more, would be more of a throughput type model. How many calls, right? Because then, you're accounting for things like potentially recall rate and shrinkage and idle. And I think it would be interesting to maybe look at both and say, if we just account for handle time, but if we want to look at it a little bit differently and think just how many calls will they handle day 1 versus day 90 versus, day 160, whatever, you could use either or model.
At the end, you kind of have to step back and say, relative to my operation, what am I trying to do? Am I trying to just communicate that, hey, attrition's a lot more costly than you think it is? Or am I really trying to play out a model which I'm using to justify other investments or other decisions that are going to be made, in which case it very well may make sense to enhance this in a fashion. And I go back to my revenue example, where at the end of the day, we had people who absolutely were not as effective at retaining customers as new hires were not as effective as retaining customers as tenured people. And we could put a cost of churn on top of our attrition rate. And as I said, I built that into a separate calculator. But I think at the end of the day, we have to ultimately come back and say, what are we trying to communicate? And then circle back and say, well, let's build the model with, and my offer's out there. If anyone wants to take the spreadsheet and enhance it with, all right, here's a repeat call factor, I can turn that into the online tool pretty easily, as long as I understand your logic around how you want to price, churn or repeat calls, or what you just mentioned as well, Jim.
Yeah, the challenge of this, of course, is like, you can make this as complicated as you want. We could add dozens of other factors in here, and so you've got to balance it, because you'll never get it right for every single person on this site. Yeah. But I do think it can be powerful. Just to your point earlier, if you understand it enough, like, you can then bring in the nuances of your own call center and sort of for that. Sometimes you get back into it, or if we find there's enough people. There's people listening and comment and they say they want to have a certain thing baked in and they absolutely feel it's necessary, then I'm sure you could go back and do it. Yep. The other thing I was going to ask, sorry, to be a pain, On the sliders, I noticed the shrink, for example. So your sliders are set within a certain range.
Yep.
There could be, I go back to my point I was making about, if it's internal teams, then of course you're paying for all the shrink. But again, we could have some people with contracts where maybe you're not paying for any shrink for the partners. That's baked into their number. And so you might want to set that at lower than the minimum, which I think you have at 20. So just wonder if that's something.
That's a good suggestion, and I can actually do that in about 5 minutes. I won't do it on the call, but and if anybody has anything around like sliders where they want to see something different, that one's real easy. That's just a range, and I program it and re-upload it. So I'll take a note on that one, and by tomorrow that'll be updated to have a 0 as an input. So
I want to know if anybody asked you to increase the occupancy over 100. I'm just curious because I have.
Yeah, well, we go up to 100, which is crazy enough as it is, which actually probably shouldn't, but I left it at 100. So
I think that's fair, but yeah, cool.
All right, so essentially from this piece here, this first half of this, the output on video on episode 7, I was essentially explaining, hey, we can come up with what this proficiency cost is by simply looking at, and I really didn't finish my statement around this. So how did we get to 468 headcount to replace? Well, at the end of the day, when you weighed out the tenured people against the people that you have to replace, you ultimately look at, this average as well, saying, well, these guys are at 540, these are at 443, we have an adjusted AHT. A quick way to do this is just to say, well, their average proficiency is 85% over the course of the year. And so effectively, we're elevating our total FTEs that we have to replace to cover workload to be 468. And that's just elevating it by the 85% of how efficient they are compared to everyone else. What I'll share next is we expanded out to say, okay, let's also incorporate the length of training, the training attrition. And I do have a question for folks on the call here is I did make an assumption and did not build this into the calculator, but when we look at new hire drops out here, the total number of people that are required based on our cost or based on our people who drop out of the class. 25% of the people drop out, 50% of the people drop out. When I went and priced it, I made some assumptions around the fact that people dropped out at the 50% mark. In other words, I didn't ask in the model if the training length is 8 weeks and 25% of the people dropped out. I basically said, on average, they dropped out at 4 weeks. Maybe some dropped out on week 1, some dropped out on week 3, some dropped out on week 7. It doesn't impact the cost tremendously because you're only paying for those people for the time period that they're trained. But I did just make an assumption rather than try to make the calculator too complicated that on average, people who drop out of training drop out at the 50% or at the 50, at the halfway mark, essentially. I don't know if that makes sense or if I'm babbling and actually communicated that clearly, but I'll just pause and see if anybody has any thoughts on new hire dropouts.
I think it makes sense. Again, going back to what we talked about a moment ago, you could probably way overcomplicate it and to get a marginally more accurate number, but I don't feel like that's necessarily the purpose.
Right. Yeah. So, again, if you've got 1% that drop out, and you guys can watch, this cell over here so that you can just see, this is effectively what's saying, hey, okay, I need to hire, the 468 people with speed to proficiency, 400 plus the proficiency cost, but I also have to hire, 5 more people or 156 more people, or if half the class drops, I have to hire actually 468 more people. But when I come down and I price this in the training section, I think this is where I did the math, yes. So when we price this here, I essentially used, and you guys can look at this, I won't go and give you painful Excel explanations, but this 2 right here is just saying, well, that's how I priced it out. I said, if these guys drop, if 25% of the people drop, they drop at the halfway point, and I'm basically factoring that so that we're not overpricing what, the annualized training FTEs cost us at the end of the day. So this output effectively now leverages the data that we use for speed to proficiency so that we could understand it's not just 400 people. We need to actually hire 68 more people because of how inefficient they are. And oh, by the way, we can't just hire that exact number of people unless you truly have a 0%, dropout rate in your class. You have to hire and account for the people who drop out. So then you end up with a total FTEs that you have to replace along with the dropouts, and then we annualize that number. So that effectively is just taking and calculating the annual cost for your training FTEs. The last piece of it simply prices all that out. And this is where I feel like the tool is powerful is, okay, if my base FTEs cost me $50,000 and I've got 1,000, my base budget is 50 million, pretty straightforward. But then we look at and break out this total annualized training cost, the total cost for onboarding. So what onboarding and any other IT costs themselves, and we break out the speed to proficiency cost. And effectively, at the end of the day, we're adding up our total cost of attrition, which in the calculator I indicate can be, twice as much or more than what somebody might anticipate. So this is kind of the math behind, the calculator itself. I'll flip over in a moment, but I'll pause and just see if I lost anyone or if you have questions on this last section behind the calculator before I.
You didn't lose me, but I will ask the question. So I'd have to go back to our capacity planning team. So, if I think of the left side where you go 40% attrition, I need to replace 400 people, and you build in the inefficiency factor. I don't know, and I'd be curious, Dave, if you do, or Ted, where I don't know that we account for the inefficiency factor. I think generally speaking, so let's say in June, we decide we need 40 new hires. I believe because those 40 will eventually, in our model, within 90 days, be like a regular person. So I don't believe we would hire 45 people because in 90 days, we're now 5 over. Rather, we would go, all right, we're building in, we account for the additional during that 90-day period, obviously map out. And that, generally speaking, that's where, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, is one of those, it could potentially be, there's that gap, right? Or you've built in enough where when you hire and you're waiting for the proficiency, you're overstaffed, right? So as your attrition goes through those next 90 days, you sort of end up in that sweet spot. Right. So that would be the only thing I would say is either within the model, and I don't know that I saw it on your HTML page, is here's what the buffer is, right? Here's your true hire number, here's your number plus the inefficiency head count, and or is there any way to account or discount for that?
Yeah, I mean, the way, and then I'll let anybody else pipe in, but the way we accounted for it, and this is what was so painful to put a thumb on what the true costs were, was that we built it into our capacity model every single week. So we had we took our monthly capacity and broke it down into 52 weeks. And then we mapped out our available against our required head count. And as attrition kept taking people out, we then said, okay, time to plop a class in on week 26. We now know that they'll graduate on week 36. And when they graduated, we adjusted our handle time accordingly. For those people who had graduated on week 36, we said, well, 36 out of 300 people means that instead of 443 on handle time, we're going to be at 453. So we accounted for it as part of the cycle of running our capacity model. But what we couldn't do was we couldn't put our thumb exactly on, well, what's the easiest way to price this? And that's exactly what bore out, this model here. Was instead of going down to this granular level and trying to piece it out, the model effectively is looking at it holistically by making assumptions around, that learning curve against the entire entity itself. So I think the short answer to your question, Jim, as you talk to your capacity plan, the folks who do it is, show me how you're inflating handle time relative to the graduation date of that new hire class in proportion to the entire population. And if they're doing it, then you should be covered in terms of what you're doing. If they're not doing it, then that might be some of what causes a gap in the capacity plan itself.
And we are, but what's interesting now that you mentioned that is, and we have a dollar value to every second of handle time.
Yep.
What's interesting is, I don't know that we've ever taken that dollar value and put it back as an attrition cost, right? Hey, we had to hire these people. And furthermore, like we spoke about earlier, that value is really based off of that imaginary handle time I think I'm going to get anyway, that is, well, we're going to have to get handle time down to X.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's kind of interesting now, now that you play it out. But how about you, Dave? How do you normally account?
It's pretty similar. I mean, I think throughout my career, what you just described was like, that was pretty much the eBay model at one point. It might not be anymore, but we did exactly that, right? We plotted in every single week, and then we looked at our requirement, our base requirement, and then we looked at how many people we expected to have when we factored everything in. And then when we started to go below the line, we put a class in, but that would inflate our requirement. And then we put a little bit more in. So it's an interesting, I don't want to jump forward to Monte Carlo or any other stuff, but what gets really interesting about this conversation is if you start to sort of connect the dots, historically the conversations we would have maybe with the business, are we willing to run under for maybe the cap plan says we're under for 4 weeks, and we might have a couple of bumpy weeks and we'll be okay, but we don't want to spend the money, or absolutely we can't do that, so we're going to spend a bunch of money just in case. But again, that's your very static one-dimensional model. And so start pulling in things like Monte Carlo, and you run the simulations and the variability and the probability of the different variations to that. You then can maybe sort of, I've been trying to think of practical ways to use it, and you can start assigning the level of risk to that. Maybe we are okay to do it. Maybe the impact from those new hires, maybe there's 10% of the possible scenarios now where we might be at risk, but we're still going to hit 90% of them, and so it's not as risky. Or maybe we're going to miss 90% of them and it's super risky, and we probably do want something. I start to think about it like that, and that's a whole different conversation. But what you both described is that's traditionally, I think most capacity plan teams you'll talk to, that's how they do it. I've never really seen it. So yeah. Anyway,
and again, my thoughts around the tool itself was ultimately a communication mechanism. Is ultimately what I was hoping to facilitate with it is exactly some of this type of communication with leaders to stress the importance of attrition. So while the calculator itself will let you put in the numbers just like we talked about, I won't try to replicate them here in real time, but you should be able to take the spreadsheet that I'm demoing here and plop those numbers in and see the exact same results spit out here. But my end goal for arming the community with the calculator was to be able to open conversations up to, look, if you're just doing back of the napkin and you're thinking it's costing us $5.8 million, guess what? With speed to proficiency, with onboarding costs, with dropouts, it's really costing you closer to 18 million. Now let's talk about, some of the things that we can do to reduce attrition and look at ROIs around that, based on these extreme costs. And we further broke it down so that we could see the cost categories, the speed to proficiency curve, and relative to an entire budget, what is our attrition costing us at the end of the day? In this particular case, it's 19% of the entire budget. So my end goal in this, rather than to get super scientific about how you would go to market and do the planning, was more to arm the community with a tool to communicate how important this is and drive attention to turnover.
I think that's right there. Sorry, Jim. I was like, that's exactly it right there. I don't know how many times throughout my career at different organizations, different teams I've talked with, it's been relatively dismissed as not that big a deal.
Right.
But and so, like you said, you back to the napkin math, like, oh, it's not that big a deal. I'm like, it actually is kind of a big deal, and we should care a bit more about it. Like I was saying at the start, if your attrition is at 0, you're probably lying. Because I don't, but and you probably shouldn't have your attrition running at 0, because there's regretted attrition which you want to keep down, but there is some attrition that's absolutely necessary. But it's finding kind of that sweet spot, and then understanding where you sit today, and then understanding with where you sit today, is there opportunity, and if there is, what does that mean? And like that's where you can start to use the calculator to start to figure out like how big a deal is this. I think attrition is always going to be an expensive part of running a contact center. It's just, what do you do do you understand how big a deal it is and how expensive it is, and what can you do to bring that down, and is the return worth the effort? So yeah, anyway, just I'm blathering again, and I cut you off, Jim, sorry. So it's because Am's holding, he's upset.
No, I think it's great. I'm even curious, again, not to over engineer or anything, and I don't know that I would. It would be kind of interesting. I wonder if there's a way to use the model to compare good versus bad attrition, right? So it'd be interesting to play around with it a little bit and see if I could model, look, if I lose people with a 2x, 3x handle time and replace them with people who get proficient, what's the difference between that and losing somebody with a spot on handle time or good productivity, right? I think there's scenarios like that. Net, I love it. I know, and I do think, especially in today's world, attrition is a big deal, right? Just the whole work environment is very different than it was a few years ago. Yep. So keeping employees, keeping them happy, making sure that they like the work, they're not overworked, we give them plenty of time to do things, is critical, aside from the dollars, right? Just because going out and even finding anybody, let's say you get those 400 people, that in and of itself is a chore, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is a problem that is only, to me, going to be a larger challenge going forward. And we spoke about that, right on episode 1. At the end of the day, the challenges in front of us, recruiting people, retaining people, this is problem's not going away anytime soon. So,
yeah, what I think is interesting about this calculator, you start to think about different ways, because you can use it for, you mentioned the state of things today. There's a lot of organizations that are like, everybody get back to the office or start coming back into the office and post-COVID. And it's really interesting to watch how those metrics change. And there might be this belief, maybe right, maybe wrong, that getting everybody back in the office will benefit. But if you start to spike attrition, for example, because Gen Z's like, I don't want to go back to the office, and so it drives some of that attrition, you might be able to start using things like this to say, well, that's actually costing us another 10, 15 million a year by forcing people back in the office.
Yep.
Maybe we should rethink it.
Even if they're less productive, it helps, right? That's a fair point. Yeah, I mean, because I think primarily, especially in a call center environment, I think that's the big factor, is if people believe that folks are less productive working from home, they're going to lean toward that bring them back in scenario. So yeah, to your point, Dave, there may be a pivot point, like, hey, if you lost a few moments, if you lost 2% productivity, don't spend 10% more in attrition, right? To get back that 2% in productivity.
Yeah, and this I have done again on other calculators, keeping it simple. If you ever want to look at annual attrition A versus annual attrition B, I can set that up as a separate lever so that you can look at the delta and just say, okay, under assumption, we're going to run 50, or you guys are making people come back to office. Now it's going up to 55. Of course, you could just slide it right here and say, okay, well, my cost was 18.1 million. Now it's 19.9 million. But I can build the calculator so that you don't have to sit there and, look at one number, move the slider. Those are easy to build as well. I'm not going to run out and do it tomorrow, but just it's out there. If I've got any other folks who are like, yeah, this really would be helpful if I could do an A versus B comparison, with the sliders. So.
Well, you just reminded me of something else I was thinking of when we were going through. I think it was the speed to proficient. No, sorry, it was the training and attrition, and you were covering that, and you're like, well, I just assume that it's going to be 50% of, halfway through. That's how many are going to leave based on the number. The reality is, everybody's will be a little different, but if you understand the math, you understand how the calculator works, you could, in theory, back into the reality of your call center still within, the basis of this model. So, you could spend forever and overcomplicate this thing, but I think for people using it, if you really want to get it super tight to the reality of your call center and you understand the math, and then most of the folks in Workforce could probably do that as long as they understand it. And so I think, the level of effort and fine tuning and doing all of this extra stuff and the work to get it, I think it's phenomenal, honestly. Like, I do think, I love the breakout. There's many things that drive the cost the best example I give is if it's not hitting your budget, then maybe you don't care. So if HR and recruiting are paying for a portion of it and it doesn't actually hit your budget, and you've got a call center budget that's not really part of that, then maybe you don't care. Not to say you shouldn't, but you don't have visibility and you don't really, maybe you're not watching it. There are plenty of organizations that run that way. They have their budget, they have their portion, and then there are impacts to other people's budgets based on what you do. And so it's connecting all those dots together, which is the really cool part of this, because maybe you then go talk to HR and go, well, maybe give me a little bit of that budget and we can save some money by doing a couple of things that will reduce this, and overall it's going to help you. So those are just kind of examples, but you begin to think much more broadly across your enterprise versus just being very focused on the call center.
Oh, perfect. All right. So I will, I just took a couple of notes here because I want to keep these as well for myself, and I will post this file along with the material here that we're reviewing out on WFM Labs on our community site. That kind of wraps up that particular calculator aspect of things. As I mentioned, we've talked about attrition for a few weeks now, and now we're going to essentially pivot to risk-rated capacity planning. So this will wrap up what we've been doing on attrition. Now, by all means, anyone watching this video, if you've got input, feel free to comment. Again, I can take these calculators and enhance them if someone's real eager to see something that would be super valuable. But going forward, we're going to start to march toward May 11th, where we'll hold a workshop like this. We'll publish a few videos in between. And I've got, again, a number of people who want to have conversations about just how do we go after this notion of risk-rated capacity plans. I'll also put a plug in for May 2nd, SWPP. I'm going to be presenting on behalf of Intradiem this notion of risk-rated capacity plans, so you can get a side peek on what we're going to be presenting on that seminar on May 2nd through the SWPP. Again, taking in these concepts of we tend to plan to a one single point on a needle. At the end of the day, we know the reality of it is that there's always going to be variance. So how do we start to build that into our capacity planning itself and express it in ways that help us break out of those fragile capacity plans. Feel free to post any comments in the community. I appreciate everybody's time today. Have a good evening, and we look forward to speaking to you all again next month.